Hey there nation, and welcome to the show where we help you to play miniatures wargaming on a budget. It is I, Commander Cheapskate, and welcome to Cheap Shots, the ultimate series for miniature wargamers who want stunning tabletop quality miniatures without breaking the bank. In this series, we'll show you how to save money on your miniatures painting hobby by using affordable craft paints, budget-friendly tools, and clever techniques. So whether you're a beginner or a seasoned hobbyist, you'll learn how to achieve incredible results without the premium price tag. And on today's episode, we're going to show you guys how to paint up a Shardspeaker for your armies of Hedonites of Slaanesh for your games of Warhammer Age of Sigmar. And when you compare it to the materials that you need to purchase from Citadel as well as Army Painter with a grand total of $195.90, and compare that to our cheapskate total of $29.92, we'll help you save your miniatures painting hobby to $165.98 and have a beautiful tabletop result at the end of it. As you can see, this is exactly what your miniature will look like at the end of doing our cheapskate method. So with that being said, let's go ahead and talk about painting up your Shardspeakers for Hedonites of Slaanesh. So for the very first step, the first thing you'll need to do, of course, is to assemble your miniature. Now this one actually is quite straightforward just because the miniature is monopose with no other options. So once you have your miniature fully assembled with your favorite type of super glue, the next thing we have to do, of course, is to texture the base. For the texture of the base, we're actually going to use a combination of both wood glue, sand, as well as water in order to create the effect. Now I know you can buy textures paints as well as texture technical paints from Citadel Miniatures. However though, that stuff is quite expensive. What I like to do instead is take some wood glue, paint the entirety of the base where I want texturing to be at, and then I dust it with some sand that I get from my backyard garden. Once I let that dry, I then make a mixture of a 50-50 slurry between both wood glue as well as water. I then apply it like a wash all over the texturing, let it dry, so that way it's a nice crisp sealant that keeps the texturing from flaking off the base. And once we're done with that, the next step of course is to prime our miniatures. So before we actually paint the miniature, the first thing we have to do, of course, is use primer. Now for my type of primer, I like to use Rust-Oleum flat white primer. You can get this at your local Walmart, and priming miniatures before painting is crucial for achieving a quality, durable, as well as even paint job. Primer provides a surface that paint can adhere to more efficiently rather than raw materials such as plastic or resin. And the reason why is because this also prevents the paint from peeling or flaking and creates a uniform base for consistent coverage for the entirety of the miniature. The second thing that primer also does too is that the color of your primer has a large impact upon the vibrancy and the values of the colors that you put onto your miniatures. Traditionally speaking, the more bold or bright color the miniature, the lighter the primer, or the more subdued or shadowy the paint job, the darker the primer you go with. Now because we're going to be doing an all-over oil wash all over this miniature that will of course darken the value of our miniatures, I'm going to go with a white primer and use really bright colors so that way we can basically take that oil wash into account. So the very next step we got to do now after the priming process is to paint our miniature, and we're going to start with the flesh on this miniature. Now luckily for us, not very much of it is exposed on this miniature as opposed to other Hedonites of Slaanesh miniatures. All you really see really is the brow, the face, or the eyes, because they have this veil that's covering their face as well as part of their chest as well as their arms. So in order to pick out that detail, we're going to use 2 thin coats of Flesh by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this color at your local Walmart for a very cheap price. We're going to put 2 thin coats on this to get a good base coverage, and then we're ready to move on to a dry brush. So next we're going to do is dry brush the flesh that we did on these miniatures, and dry brushing does a couple of things that helps us with miniature painting. The first thing that it does, it creates the illusion of depth on our miniatures because the pigments of the paints adhere to the raised surfaces of the miniature while leaving the darker base coat in the recesses. This creates a kind of a situation where you see highlighting as well as shadows taking place in your miniature. Now for this one, we're going to use Peaches and Cream by Delta Serum Coat. We're going to do a quick once over real fast with dry brushing onto the miniature to bring up the level of detail to the level of brightness that we want. Now when it comes to dry brushing, I always suggest that you go with a very light dry brush because you could always add successive layers of brightness and detailing to your miniatures. So always start with a very light amount first and then build up to the detail that you want, because it's very easy to add more dry brushing to a miniature, but it's very difficult to take it back off once you've actually had it done. And you will have this kind of chalky pastel texture when you get finished with your dry brushing, but don't worry, when we get to the oil washing stage, the oil washing stage will smooth out those transitions and take away that chalky texture. The next detail we're going to focus on this miniature are on the things like the staff that the character is carrying, as well as their leather boots, as well as the horns of their helmet. So to pick out that detail, we're going to use 2 thin layers of pigment by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this stuff at your local Walmart for a very low price. And we're using this so that we have a good solid base coat in order to build dry brushing onto it. Plus the black is going to contrast very nicely with the purples and pinks that we're going to use for a majority of this miniature. So just make sure you get a really good coverage of this color, and then we're ready to move on to our dry brushing. So when it comes to dry brushing black colors on our miniatures, I like to do a 2-step process for our dry brushing. The very first step is we're going to use Pewter by Apple Barrel Paint, and that's to create a little bit of a mid-tone highlighting on all the items that we did on black. So things like the smoothness of the staff, as well as some of the studs that's along the staff length. We're also going to do the same thing for the horns, as well as for the leather that the boots that this character is wearing. And then once again, we're going to do one more layer of dry brushing directly on the part that we did in Pewter Gray earlier. This time we're using Folk Arts Pale Gray. You can get this at your local Walmart as well. It's a very nice opaque gray color that's almost close to white, but not quite. It's a nice little detail to add some additional final highlightings on both the horns, the boots, as well as on the staff that the character is wearing. And now we're done with our dry brushing, we can start working on the clothing of the miniature. So when it comes to the clothing for this miniature, we're actually going to use a couple of different shades of purples as well as pinks, because this is a Hedonites of Slaanesh army, and different ranges of purples and pink are usually apropos to their color scheme. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to work on the main robes that this character is wearing, which covers their chest, their arms, as well as their legs. And we're going to use 2 thin layers of Wild Iris by Apple Barrel Paint. You can get this at your local Walmart. We're just going to do quick 2 thin coats directly onto the on the baseline of the robes. Now you do have to be a little careful when you actually paint this, just because you want to make sure that you don't get this paint directly on the flesh. But if you do make that mistake, it's perfectly fine. All you gotta do is knead up with some more flesh with Apple Barrel Paint. The next detail we're going to focus on now is on the tabard / sash that this character is wearing, which is basically around their waist as well as going down like a loincloth. We're going to paint that in 2 thin layers of Purple Pansy by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a rich dark purple that you can get at your local Walmart. It does a beautiful job of bringing out that detail. At the same time, it complements the lighter color purple that we used on the robes on the earlier step. The last detail we're going to pick up on their clothing are on the veil that covers the face, as well as the cloak that they're wearing that's connecting their wrist to their back as well. Kind of has like this very florid, kind of very airy kind of look with this miniature. Now for that color, we're going to use Lilac Mist by Apple Barrel Paint. It's a nice pale, kind of almost fuchsia color that we're going to use to paint this for 2 reasons. One, it complements the purple paint scheme that we have on the clothing earlier, and secondly, it's also kind of contrasts nicely enough against the darker shades of purple that we use on the miniature as well. Just make sure you get a good solid base coat of that lilac mist on the fabric, and just be a little bit careful when you go near the face, so that way you don't spill this over into the eyes. And if you do, just knead it with some flesh paint, and then you're ready to move on. Now when it comes to the dry brushing for all the purple fabric, we're actually use the exact same color for all of it, so that way it kind of ties it all together. And that color, of course, is Princess Pink. It's made by Anita's Acrylic. You can get this at your local Hobby Lobby. It's a nice, very pastel pink color that when you dry brush it, adds a lot of the details we couldn't see earlier. Things like the folds of the fabric, for example, as well as the texturing of the cloth this character is wearing. At the same time, it also does a really nice job of covering all 3 layers that we did earlier, the different shades of purple, and kind of adds a little bit of uniformity to that. And once you're done with your dry brushing, oddly enough, most of the miniature is actually completed. We can start working on the finer details. So one of the first details we're actually going to work on is on the staff that the character is carrying, specifically the little wisp of smoke that's coming off that silver orb that's on the top of their staff. Now we're going to kind of create this kind of ethereal look for it, like some kind of ghostly, spectral, magical mist. And to get that effect, we're going to use 2 thin layers of Dutch Aqua by Folk Art. You can get this at your local Walmart. We're going to add 2 thin layers directly onto the wispy portions of that staff to make it look like it's kind of ethereal and kind of glowing as well. We're also going to use some glazing to kind of make this look more supernatural and glowing, but we'll talk about that when we get to that step. The next detail we're going to focus on are on some of the finer details like the skull as well as a scroll that's on the hips of this Shardspeaker. So we got these little pouches that kind of decorate their belt that they're wearing. So to bring out that detail, we're using light mocha by Apple Roll Paint. It's a nice kind of bonish kind of color that contrasts nicely with all the purples that we've done earlier. And it also contrasts quite nicely with the Dutch aqua that we have for the wisps coming off of the staff. Just put 2 thin layers on those details and be careful not to spill it over onto the purple bits that we painted earlier. So now with most of the clothing finished, the next we're going to work on now are on the metal details that are on these miniatures. Now we're going to use a couple of colors in order to achieve these effects. First of all, with the mirror that the Shardspeaker is carrying, we're actually going to pick out that detail in 2 thin coats of Anniversary Silver by Folk Art, as well as the sphere on the staff that the character is also carrying as well. The reason why we're doing that is because the Folk Art Anniversary Silver has a little bit of a blue tinge to it, and it looks like a perfect color to use for a reflective surface, which makes sense because the Shardspeaker is actually looking at a mirror that's actually supposed to be from Slaanesh's mirror, so it kind of matches that way. So we're going to pick out those details there. We're also going to use gunmetal gray for the other silver details, things like, for example, like the chain with a little medallion that's hanging off of their belt, for example, as well as the pauldrons that this character is wearing on their shoulders. And then for the rest of the details, we're going to stick with a beautiful color called Emperor's Gold by Deco Art. It's a nice, rich, dark gold color that contrasts nicely with all the purple that is within this group. It also complements the teal color that we have that's going on the wisp with the smoke, and it also contrasts nicely with all the silver elements that we did in Anniversary Silver as well as gunmetal. Plus, it kind of adds that overall kind of gaudy, kind of golden look that these guys are going for, especially with the helmet. So because we're going to pick out those details like the helmet, for example, the medallion on their chest, the belt that they're wearing as well as the metallic elements on the staff. We're also going to use this to be very careful to make sure that we don't take out the Dutch aqua that we did earlier, but that picking up that Slaanesh symbol that's on the staff as well. And then once you are done with your metallic elements, the next thing we start working on are the finer details. So one of the last fine details we're going to work on this miniature are on the jewelry that this character is wearing. They actually have a lot of gemstones on their armor, their belt, as well as their medallion, as well as the mirror that they're holding. So to pick out that detail, we're just going to put 2 thin dots of green turquoise of Apple Barrel paint in order to bring out that detail. That green turquoise contrasts nicely with all the gold that's in this miniature, so it kind of creates that eye-catching detail. And once we're done with that, the next thing we can start working on is on the bases. So for the masonry of the ruined temple that the Slaanesh Shardspeaker is standing on, we're going to use 2 thin coats of Skyline by Folk Art, and the reason why is because it's a nice kind of grayish blue color. It kind of matches some of the terrain that we have for our studio's Mordheim terrain, as well as for some of the Warhammer terrain that we have as well. So I think it'd be a nice little detail to add to that. And then lastly, for the actual texturing on the bases, I like to go with this kind of purplish grayish base that I use for the studio's Slaanesh collection, just to make it look like these guys are like from another outer world kind of chaos, different dimension type of vibe. So to create that effect, I'm going to put 2 thin layers of Concord Gray by Apple Roll Paint, which you can also get at Walmart directly on the texturing. And if you notice that some of the white undercoat is peeking out, that's perfectly fine. We're going to dry brush with some pale gray anyway, so just going to add to the dry brushing. And speaking of dry brushing, what we're going to do now is use some Folk Art's Pale Gray. We're going to dry brush the masonry that this character is standing on, as well as the texturing on the base. And we're also going to give a thin little dry brushing of Pale Gray directly on the smoke of the Dutch aqua that we picked out earlier with Dutch aqua, to kind of give this kind of smoky vapors kind of look. And now that we're done with the dry brushing, the next thing I gotta do, of course, is a glaze. So as I mentioned before, we're going to have this kind of glowing ethereal look with the Dutch aqua that we did earlier, and the best way to achieve that result is by using glazing. Now if you want to know what glazing is basically you take acrylic paint and you thin it down to water almost to the point where it's like a wash. Alright, so you want to make it very liquidy and also very runny as well. What you're going to do is you're going to apply this stuff like a wash all over the smoke wisp that we did earlier. Now what this does is a couple of things. The first thing that this does, of course, is that it allows the bright blue to seep in directly into the recesses to kind of create this kind of glowing blue effect that's taking place on the wisps that we did earlier. At the same time, it also reacts to the dry brushing as well as the Dutch aqua, making artificial highlights, make it look like it's kind of glowing at a distance. Now to achieve this effect, you got to put successive layers of glazing directly onto the smoke wisp, so it's going to take a while to do this. I actually took 4 coats in order to do this. What you have to do is you have to apply the glaze like a wash all over the part that you want glowing. You have to wait for it to dry completely before you can add the next glaze, and you're slowly slowly building up layers of glaze on this to create that ethereal effect. Now it is kind of time consuming, it is quite boring because after you add that glaze you have to wait for it to dry. My suggestion to you, as you can see in the background of this picture, is to work on multiple projects, so that way while you're waiting for one coat to dry for your glazing, you're working on other projects instead. So like I said before, it took me 4 layers to get this result done, and by the time it gets finished it looks absolutely fantastic. So our next step, of course, is to give our miniatures an oil wash. Now, a lot of people like to use Army Painter Strong Tone to do the oil washing on the miniatures, which is perfectly fine because Army Painter Strong Tone does a perfect job for what it does, what it advertises. However, though, it is quite expensive at $30 a can, while as a can of mid-wax polyshade and mission oak color for polyacrylic, it achieves the exact same result but at a fraction of the price. So what we're going to do is we're going to add this like a wash over almost the entire miniature. The part that we're actually going to avoid with the oil wash are 2 locations. The first one is going to be the silver sphere of the staff that this character is carrying, as well as the ethereal wisp that we did earlier. So don't apply the oil wash to those sections because we want to keep that bright and glowing, but everything else fair game. So things like the clothing, for example, the flesh, the base, the masonry, the staff itself, the symbol of Slaanesh. Just be very careful not to put this oil wash on the silver part of the staff as well as on the silver mist, and then you'll be perfectly fine. Now what this oil wash does a couple of things. The first thing that it does is seeps directly into the pieces of the miniature, bringing a lot of the details we couldn't see before. So things like the individual folding of the fabric, the musculature, the texturing of the bases, the little bits of metallic details on the metals, all those things. The second thing it also does too is it smooths out the transitions between our dry brushes as well as our base coats, so that way that chalky pastel appearance is now completely gone. The last thing that it also does too is that it also darkens the value of the colors that we put on our miniature. That's the reason why we stuck with the colors that we did, because that oil wash will darken them down. Now once you're done applying your oil wash, you'll need to wait 24 hours for this stuff to dry and cure, so that way the polyurethane also protects your miniature. The polyurethane will have a high gloss sheen when it's finished, and at the same time also prevent your paint from chipping as well as fading. My suggestion to you is to use this oil wash stage as the very last step of whatever you usually paint. Wait 24 hours to return back to your project and then continue on. So we left this miniature to dry and cure for 24 hours. The next thing we gotta do, of course, now is to rim the bases. And for the base color on this one, I like to use Pewter Gray by Albemarle Paint. I put 2 thin layers directly onto the rim of the bases. And the reason why I do this is for 2 reasons. The first reason why I do this is because it's gonna match the rest of the Slaaneshly themed armies that we have in our studio's Warhammer collection. This exact same basic material that we use for that. And secondly, it also works with the urban environment of Morheim, which I'm planning on using this miniature for in the first place. Now the very last step we're going to use on this miniature is a matte varnish spray. Now this step is completely optional, and the reason why is because the polyurethane will have a high gloss finish on the miniature. Now if you do like that high gloss finish, you could of course skip this step. However, I like my miniatures more subdued and more matte, so because I use a can of Crownline matte varnish spray, which I get at my local Walmart, I just give it the once over of the entirety of the miniature, and as you can see, it mutes down the sheen and also brings a lot of those details we couldn't see from the high gloss finish. And with that, this brings us to our end result, and as you can see, we painted this miniature up to a beautiful tabletop standard, and by using truly cheap craft paints, we saved a ton of money at the exact same time. So now that we're done showing you exactly how we paint up this miniature using our cheapskate method, let's talk about the materials that you need to buy from Army Painter as well as Citadel if you want to achieve the exact same results we did, but using their name brand paints instead. So this is the shopping list you need to buy from both Citadel as well as Army Painter if you want to achieve the exact result we did but using their name brand paints instead. You'll need to buy a can of Corex White Spray for $17, as well as the colors Thunderhawk Blue, Wraithbone, Bane Blade Brown, Averland Sunset, Genestealer Purple, Dakala Lilac, Teclis Blue, Cadian Flesh Tone, Baylord Brown, Slaanesh Gray, Eshin Gray, Flay One Fresh, Fulgrim Pink, XV88, Rust Gray, and Ulthuan Gray, and all those colors cost you $4.55 per pot. You also need to buy Leviathan Purple, Pterodon Turquoise, Astra Granite, Leadbelcher, Ironbreaker, Aethermatic Blue, as well as Retributor Armor, and all those colors cost $7.80 for those. You also need to buy a can of Army Painter Strong Tone for $32, as well as a can of Mutarian Varnish for that matte finish for $19.50. And assuming that you're purchasing all these materials for the very first time, you're talking about a grand total investment of $195.90 to paint up your Shardspeaker the same way we did, but using those Citadel as well as Army Painter products. Now when you subtract that from our cheapskate total of $29.92, you end with a grand total savings of $165.98. So there you guys have it. This is a quick way for you guys to save a lot of money on the miniature wargaming hobby. So if you're looking for a way to save some money on your hobby, may I suggest switching to cheaper craft paints. After all, you get similar results at a fraction of the price, and you can achieve the exact beautiful tabletop standard as we did as well. And during these inflationary times, it's kind of important to save money on your hobby anyways. So that's good for this video, you guys. As always, feel free to like, comment, and or subscribe. You guys' input is valuable to us as always. I am Commander Cheapskate. I will catch you guys next one. Peace out and stay classy.